Let me tell y'all what I think I'm here for. And if it's not what you think I'm here for, I'm in trouble and some distance from home. And that is to work on some work I have been doing the past few years, one of which is getting my collar unbuttoned. To work on some work that I've been doing the past few years, the fundamental thesis of which is that the basic problem of contemporary organizations, broadly defined to include families and churches and businesses and government and academic institutions, is the inability to cope with the fact that we agree with one another, and not the inability to cope with the fact we are in conflict. In fact, that most conflict of all kinds in organizations is phony and is unconsciously designed to release us from the responsibility of doing anything significant. So what I would like to do today is work with you on managing agreement in organizations, or how to cope with the Abeline paradox. As you will find, it is a very personal statement, subject to my own bizarre peculiarities and biases and odd ways of seeing the world. And because it is a personal statement, and also since I found the Abeline paradox is not exactly a household word, I think y'all are going to need to know a little bit more about me than George told you in the introduction, about how I got here, about where I came from, about my family, and particularly about how we spend our vacations. Now, I have suggested to George that I show home movies at this time. He has suggested that I not show home movies at this time. So as a way of kind of getting into the paradox, I'd like to start by telling y'all something about life with the Harveys. And just start by saying, as the map on the board might indicate, I am a native son of the great sovereign state of Texas. My home is Austin. That means hook 'em horns down there. In Italy, it means something entirely different. I found that out when I went to the University of Texas football game with an Italian friend of mine, and 70,000 people gave that in the kickoff, and he thought he was in the largest collection of perverts he'd ever seen, and in some ways may have been accurate. My wife's from a little town called Coleman, which is 53 miles southeast of Abeline on Route 84. Let me just see how much work I'm going to have to do and count the house. How many of y'all have been to Abeline? Just curious. Oh, a fair number. How many have been to Coleman? When were you in Coleman? Yeah. What were you doing there? I knew you looked a little more moral than the rest. And when were you in Coleman? 60. Well then, but anyone else been to Coleman? Well, then with the exception of you two, it's a very provincial group. My wife's from a little town called Coleman, which is 53 miles southeast of Abilene on Route 84. Did anyone see the movie The Last Picture Show? How many saw that? If you saw that movie, you saw Coleman. In fact, my father-in-law ran the pool hall and domino parlor at Bangs, Texas. 12 miles outside of Coleman. He had to run it in Bangs, and it's a carbon copy of the one in The Last Picture Show, right down to the last paint fleck. He had to run it in Bangs because Coleman is a Southern Baptist town. There's no drinking, smoking, card playing, mixed bathing, fornication, or pool shooting, at least legally. And he ran it in Bangs to get away from the Baptists. If you saw The Last Picture Show, you saw his pool hall right down to the last paint fleck, as I said. If you remember, Ben Johnson played the protagonist role in that movie. And if you listen, shut your eyes and listen to Ben Johnson talk, you heard my father-in-law talk, and he played the same role in the town. You remember the football coach in the movie had a little tin roof white house on stilts and a tin roof garage on the left side. Move it to the right side, and you saw the house my mother-in-law still lives in. My wife and I went to see that movie down at the M Street Theater in Washington about 6 months after her dad died. And we didn't know what we were getting into, and suddenly there was our town, her dad, his pool hall, and our whole life flashed before us. We left the movie in a spring rain, walked up through DuPont Circle so choked up and just started bawling. By that I meant crying. And it was an hour before either of us could talk. Well, anyway, as the vote might indicate, Coleman is not exactly the mainstream of the culture. It has 5,609 people. The Coleman Philharmonic Orchestra consists of Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys and the National Guard Armory on Saturday night, starting with I Didn't Know God Made Honky Tonk Angels, and then working slowly up to a roaring climax. The major social event in Coleman is not the presidential dinners as it is here in Washington, but it's the Coleman County Rodeo, during which time there is a rule that anyone that rides a horse into the rodeo grounds gets in free, and during rodeo time there'll be 5,609 people and 6,200 horses in town. And to make a bad but absolutely accurate pun, Coleman takes on an atmosphere of its own. A number of years ago, shortly after Beth and I were married, every summer we would make a 9-9 theory-wide, joint, participative, problem-solving, collaborative, loving decision to spend 2 glorious weeks of our summer vacation with her mama and papa in downtown Coleman. And I guess it was about in 62 or 63, we went to Coleman in the middle of July during a West Texas drought. Anyone been in West Texas during drought time? Anyone? Well, a fair number. Let me just, if you haven't, it's the middle of July, it's 106 degrees by the Walgreens X-Lax temperature gauge in the back. It hadn't rained for 35 days, and under those conditions, the wind just picks up the prairie and blows it into Mexico. People take masking tape, I don't see any around here, mask around the windows to keep the dust out, stick wet towels under the door, and dust still just blows through and accumulates on everything. You drive with your lights on in broad daylight just like it's a dense fog, and people do the best they can to make do. Well, anyway, it's 106 degrees in the shade. It's a Sunday afternoon, and we are having what for Coleman is a rip-roaring afternoon of Sunday entertainment, which consists of playing dominoes and sipping lemonade. Coleman is dry in more than one way. You can get alcoholic beverages for medicinal purposes on a doctor's prescription, and to look at people's medicine cabinet, a plague is impending, but we couldn't work up an illness. And do any of y'all play dominoes? Anyone? Well, as you know, it's not a terribly debilitating game. Someone says shuffle 'em, somebody says mark me, somebody says your game, someone says let's play 42, someone says pass the lemonade. Having a hell of a time. Also sitting in front of a swamp cooler. Do y'all know what a swamp cooler is? Well, for those that don't, in that part of the country, the humidity is so low and the temperature is so high, you don't need an air conditioning unit with a coil and a compressor. You just take a big box, line it with hay, put copper tubing around the top end of the hay, drill holes in the copper tubing, then pump water through that tubing. It lets water dribble down through the hay and wet the hay, and then you blow air through that wet hay at a very high level, and that blows mud out across the room. Anyway, we're sitting in front of the swamp cooler playing dominoes, and all of a sudden my father-in-law, his name's Lehman, playing partners with me, looks up and says, "Hey, y'all, let's go to Abeline and eat at the cafeteria." Well, I don't know if you've ever been in heat like that, but your mind just doesn't leap into gear. So I start turning his proposal over in my mind, and it goes something like this. God almighty. Go to Abeline and eat at the cafeteria. It's 53 miles to Abeline. It's 106 degrees in the shade. We've got a 1958 unair-conditioned Buick with no shock absorbers. And if any of y'all ever hit Route 84 out towards Abilene, it's just a series of chug holes with a little asphalt around them for aesthetic purposes. And the Abilene cafeteria is very reminiscent of the enlisted man's field mess at Fort Bliss. And so as I'm turning my proposal and my reply over in my mind, suddenly my wife, Beth, who's playing on my right, looks up and says, "Sounds like a great idea, but I don't want to go unless you want to go, Jerry." Well, I've been through that one before. And I suddenly hear my voice saying, "Joy unbounded, I've just been sitting here hoping someone would invite me to go to Abeline and eat at the cafeteria, but I don't want to go unless your mama wants to go." And Mama's over there in her calico dress with her stockings rolled down around her ankles, grinning like the cat that ate the canary, and she says, "Of course I want to go. You don't think I want to eat leftovers from the icebox, do you?" So we all go pile into the furnace and start for Abeline. We take a rest stop at the pool hall at Bangs, because by then you don't know whether your kidneys are located between your hip bones or your shoulder blades. We blaze into the Abeline cafeteria, have literally the worst meal known to mankind. Some 4 hours later, with lights still ablaze in broad daylight, we wheel back across the prairie through a driving dust storm and into the football coach's little tin-roof garage. By then, I don't know if you've ever been where you can just take your fingers and scrape streaks down your arm where the dust and perspiration cements everything together. And everybody piles out and goes down and sits in front of the mud machine. And by actual count, for some 45 minutes, no one said a single solitary word. There was absolute teetotal silence. Well, having been trained 4 years as a clinical psychologist, 3 years as a social psychologist, having a PhD in general psychology, 2 years of consulting experience as an organization development consultant, and having written a half-dozen articles for professional journals in group dynamics, I began to feel something was amiss. And so I came forth with what y'all in this class may have heard of. It's called a behavioral science intervention. And I said, it was a great trip, wasn't it? And my father-in-law looked up, and he only said one word. And interestingly enough to me, I never heard him say the word before in his life, and until we laid him under, I never heard him repeat it. Everybody in here will have heard the word, but with the exception of you two in the left balcony, no one will have heard it said quite as he said it. And that is, I said, it was a great trip, wasn't it? And he looks up and says, "She." Again, drawing on the wellspring of knowledge that only a PhD will provide one, I said, "What did you mean by that?" And his reply was kind of classic, and it was, "Well, hell, I never wanted to go to Abeline to begin with. I was just making conversation, and you idiots took me up on it. You ruined my day." And I said, "What do you mean, we idiots? I didn't want to go to Abeline. I went because the three of you pressured me into it. My wife said you had to be insane to invite me out in a dust storm to eat at the Abeline cafeteria," and her mama began to cry. And from about 7:30 in the evening till 1:30 in the morning, we engaged in what is still called the Wilder family fight, where we argued as to who got us to Abeline when no one wanted to go to begin with. And when things got back on speaking terms, and we were able to talk with some clarity, I formulated what's called the Abeline paradox, which is as follows: that organizations frequently take actions contrary to the desires of any of their members and defeat the very purposes those organizations are designed to achieve. That organizations frequently take actions contrary to the desires of any of their members and defeat the very purposes they're designed to achieve. And a corollary to that is that the inability to cope with agreement and not the inability to cope with conflict is central to organization dysfunction, because we all agreed that day on what we wanted to do and turned around and did just the opposite. So between now and 11:30, what I'd like to do with y'all is work with you on the Abeline paradox. And I'd like to describe some other trips that I'm familiar with, to talk about what causes that kind of insanity, because it is indeed insanity. Then I've wired together a questionnaire, and it takes about 10 minutes to fill out. I'd like to pass it out and let y'all just it asks you to briefly, in 1 or 2 words, describe a potential trip you may be on, answer 10 true-false questions about it, and then in 1-sentence segments say what, if anything, you'd like to do about it, and then we'll take a little break. And then I'm not going to ask you to discuss the answers to those things, incidentally, because some people like to put on things that are quite personal. I'll be glad to talk with you afterward about them, or even in here if you want to. Then we'll take a break and come back, and I'd like to tell you in general what those answers mean, to describe some implications of those answers, a couple of skills for getting out of Abeline if you find yourself there and want to leave, and then it should be about 11:30, and I shall ride into the sunset, hopefully paid. Are there any questions? Incidentally, as we roll along, I know this is a big group, but it may appear that I'm on a track that I got to follow. I don't have to follow it in any particular way. So as we roll along, if y'all got questions or comments or things you want to say or talk about, just stop me and I'll show you where you're wrong. Any questions? Okay, well, what I'd like, could we get another slide up there? God, isn't that magical? Oh, Lordy. What I'd like to do is to talk with you about the Abeline paradox in the bedroom, boardroom, oval room, and airport. Not because that's the only place it occurs, but because that runs the gamut of my own experience.